Your bike fit can make or break your cycling experience, and chances are you've got some burning questions that haven't been answered until now. Because in today's video, pro bike fitter Lee Prescott tackles some of the most asked questions you recently submitted. And we kick things off with a fantastic question. Does swapping the short cranks really make a difference? Let's dive in and find out.
Obviously a bit of a hot topic at the moment with Pogacar riding a shorter crank. I myself ride a 165, although I am a short ass, so that's, okay. What impact does it actually have? So most of us can ride along on, like a 170 crank, fine. There is a definite move towards shorter cranks generally, because there's some good sports science out there now that kind of indicates that a slightly shorter crank doesn't reduce the power production. You have to increase your cadence very slightly, but what that also does is the muscles, because the muscles are using a higher muscle velocity, they can work in a slightly more efficient way. This is probably why Pogacar's using them. Also, his position is pretty aggressive, which means that his torso is very rotated. That means that when his leg comes up and over the top of the pedal stroke, this angle closes up quite a lot. Now, if that angle gets too small, what can happen is one of the big arteries that runs through this area of the body gets crimped, and that can cause issues, a little bit like DVT. We see it a lot with people in extreme time trial positions, for instance. By shortening that crank, what you're doing is you're meaning that basically the foot and the leg doesn't have to come up quite as high, so it reduces this closed hip angle, so it opens up the hip. That makes it safer, more efficient, and also your foot is moving in a smaller diameter, so your foot for one given revolution is traveling through less path, and that's part of why it's slightly more efficient. Now, does everybody need to switch to smaller cranks? No, unless you've got hip impingements, functional issues with your pelvis, or you're going to be in a very aggressive position, is probably the one time that you would want to shorten that up. So either hip impingements, functional problems, or very aggressive positions. That's where I would normally look to recommend a shorter crank. And we have done, we fitted some 135 cranks recently to a lady's bike that we built because of her hip function. But most of us, if we're just riding normal road bikes in a normal road bike kind of average position, you don't need to spend that money if you don't want to. So this is quite a common issue that we get asked a lot, is discomfort in the saddle, 2 hours, it being an issue. And it's, without seeing the bike, it's really difficult to actually comment on it specifically what's wrong. But the usual suspects would be something like, making sure that the saddle's in the right place. Normally, it's actually not the saddle that's the problem, it's the fact that it's in the wrong position. It might be too high, too low, fore and aft might be wrong. Also, if you're running your saddle anything other than level, then there's probably an issue there as well. Now, you say that you have had a couple of bike fits and it has helped. So, I would suggest potentially continuing down that route. Try and find a bike fitter local to you that can use saddle pressure mapping if you haven't already. That can really help that fitter work out what's going on kind of under the bonnet, so to speak, and where the high pressure spots are, because obviously we don't know what part of the saddle is uncomfortable and even whether you're sitting on it properly. And I think another thing just worth mentioning is, without reiterating things around chamois cream, which we've done in a previous video, but how often are you riding 2 hours? If you're only riding 2 hours once a month and all your other rides are much shorter, or you're not doing a longer distance regularly, then it might just be that the soft tissue that's sitting, compressed between the bone and the saddle is actually not ever getting to the point of breaking down and building itself up again to be stronger and tougher and able to take the pressures that you're putting it under. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. You know, we often see saddle discomfort on people that don't ride their bike all week and then go and do 3 hours at the weekend. And all you're doing there really is, you know, breaking down the soft tissue, making it uncomfortable. It then repairs itself and then starts to atrophy again. So by the next weekend, you haven't built up any kind of latent robustness in that soft tissue. Neck and shoulder pain and hip flexor pain, they may not be linked, but I would suspect they probably are, especially if you're on a race bike and you want this sort of aggressive position. Sounds to me like potentially your pelvis isn't correctly engaging with the saddle. So it might be that you're over rotating or even moving further forwards. And that's resulting in your pelvis not being stable. Okay. And if the pelvis isn't stable, your pelvis being the foundation of your big corset of muscles that reacts to that, it means that none of your kind of torso can stabilize itself. That means you're having to hold yourself up with your arms, which is going to lead to fatigue in the neck and shoulders. I think the other thing I would definitely check as well is that your bar width is correct. You know, as we've mentioned previously, bar width should be shoulder width for kind of optimum comfort and performance. As soon as it's too narrow, the elbows pop out and you lose all your aero benefit, or if it's too wide, your elbows pop out and you start to do this, and again, all the trapezius and rhomboids start to fatigue and you get neck and shoulder pain. With the hip flexor pain as well, it seems from what you're saying like potentially your saddle might not be in the right spot, and that is probably why you're not getting pelvic stability. So a little like the last question, if you've got a slammed bike that's been chopped and you're getting neck and shoulder pain, obviously some of that might be because you're simply rotated too far and having to put too much weight on your hands. Now, you can test this by try riding in the drops a little bit more and see if you still get the same neck and shoulder pain. If not, it might be that actually that extra little bit of rotation has made your pelvis engage better, allowing you to support yourself with your muscles rather than your arms. If that isn't the case, really your only option is either get a steerotube extender, which some very good frame builders might be able to do for you, or you could look at one of those kind of hover bar type bars to lift the tops hoods up. I think some of them, you know, will lift it up to about 1 inch, and that's probably your only option.
Can you rotate hoods back?
No, don't do that, because as soon as you rotate, I mean, that's even if he's able to and it's not an integrated cockpit, if you do rotate the bars back, all that's doing is changing your contact patch with your hand, which can lead to other things like cyclist palsy, you know, compression of the ulnar nerve, but also it then precludes you from actually reaching the brake levers properly from the drops, which is just dangerous, right? So, you know, bars swept up are one of those early warning signs for us fitters that something's already wrong. If you're getting chafing, especially if it's only on one side, that smacks of a couple of things, right? So you mentioned that you're already using chamois cream. What I would suggest is when you're putting chamois cream on, make sure you put it on the pad and cover the whole pad. Rather than just putting it on you, okay? Because then that's making sure that there's no bacterial buildup in any one place, which can obviously affect the dermis, okay? So that's kind of part number one. Secondly, you know, if you are only chafing on one side, I would suggest there's some sort of asymmetry going on with the pelvis, yeah? So it's either sitting a little twisted, or you're not sitting in the right place on the saddle. And that can be for a few reasons. It could be that the position is not correct. It also could be that you've got functional asymmetry of some description. So I would seek advice on that and see if you can figure out what's going on. You know, go and see a good certified bike fitter, or even go and see like an osteopath or a chiropractor and try and get some sort of idea of where the asymmetry is coming from. Quite often what can happen is that you know, people think of the pelvis as like a big bone, but it's actually not. It's several bones joined together, and what can happen is that sometimes these bones can get into torsion whereby they're not fully aligned correctly, or they can literally you can get twisted because you've got tightnesses or cross patterns going on in the back that are pulling everything off skew. So often it's you that needs to get sorted out, not the actual bike. It's not a kit issue as such, potentially, and I would seek some certified advice. So with a short inseam, I'm assuming that also means that for your total height, your legs are shorter. Which means you've probably got a longer torso. So anthropomorphically, you're outside of norms. That doesn't necessarily mean you need shorter cranks. I think the more important thing is that you're on the right size bike in the first place. Shorter cranks, especially down to kind of 150 and 155, for a start are going to be more difficult for you to get. There are some good brands out there that will make them. But I'd suggest typically shorter cranks like that really are more for if you've got hip dysfunction, you've got issues with hip flexors or pelvic hip mobilization. The shorter cranks normally are to try and open that hip up, you know, prevent a too closed hip angle. Not necessarily required for short legs. I think the key there is having the right size bike so you can get the saddle and saddle height in the right place. Unfortunately, a lot of bikes are not well proportioned these days for normal human beings. However, short legs, long torso is probably the one scenario where you'll find more bikes to fit you than the other way around.